Section 210 deals with alternative media and processes. Artworks made with alternative media and processes typically break traditional boundaries between artistic media and between art and life. These tend to emphasize actions and ideas over the physical product or object. Um, More importance is placed on the creative process than the final product. Um, and the creative process can produce events, ideas, experiences, as well as objects, all of which could be considered art. So, for some context here, we could consider the idea of conceptual art, which emphasizes ideas and radically downplays the importance of work or of the work of art as a craft object. This is really a movement that flourished in the contemporary period, so from the 1960s onward, but um, it's actually indebted to Dada artists. So Dada is an artistic movement that emerged during the brutality of World War I, from about 1914 to 1924. These artists were disillusioned with the corporate society and nationalist politics and the repressive social values that they were seeing. They launched a full-out assault against conventional definitions of art and rational thought itself. They declared themselves anti-war, anti-art, anti-middle class, anti-everything, really. They rejected most moral, social, political, and aesthetic values, traditions, and conventions. They refused to make sense or pin themselves down or call themselves a specific movement. Really, they emphasized individuality, irrationality, imagination, and chance, and issued challenges to the traditional notions of art. One of the most famous Dada artists is Marcel Duchamp. He is key in the New York Dada movement. He moved from France to New York in 1915 because of World War I, and he pioneered the practice of appropriation, or the deliberate incorporation of materials created by other artists or people in his artworks in order to challenge those traditional notions of art. So an artist appropriates pre-existing images or objects and potentially alters them in a way that changes the original meaning or purpose. Um, Sometimes we call these found objects or images. Typically, found objects and images have little to no alteration before they are used in an artwork, or sometimes they may just be presented as a work of art themselves. Ready-made objects are everyday objects that are presented as works of art without any sorts of alteration, really. Assemblage is the process of gathering three-dimensional materials and objects, including found objects and ready-mades, and fabricating them into a work of art. So here we have Duchamp's bicycle wheel, which we've looked at a little bit before. He originally made this in about 1913, though it was lost and recreated a few times. This one at the MoMA, I think, was made in 1951. But it is an assemblage of found objects, or maybe we could call it an assisted ready-made. And it really kind of encompasses the spirit of Dada, this anti-art, kind of anti-war idea, irrational kind of silliness almost. It does resemble a sculpture in which the stool could be considered the base or the pedestal and the wheel would be the subject. Duchamp said that he made this simply because he liked to look at it. So it is kinetic, the wheel spins, and he likened this to watching flames in a fireplace. So for Duchamp, the making and the appearance of a work of art were secondary to the choices of the artist and the art's effect in the viewer's mind.
The practice of gathering objects and fabricating them into a work of art is called assemblage, and this is very much inspired by or informed by what Duchamp was doing with his found objects. The gathered objects or the found objects are repurposed so that they support the visual ideas and compositions that the artist desires. So, for example, the contemporary African American artist Betty Saar created this work, The Liberation of Aunt Jemima, by collecting a variety of different found objects, including cotton, syrup bottle labels, and a stereotypical mammy doll, and assembled them into a wooden box. The objects here symbolize the relics and memorabilia of both personal and societal history as they relate to issues of both gender and race. These pieces represent influences that were important to traditional African groups. Saar is interested in exploring themes of personal and communal identity, and her art examines the survival of African traditions in Black culture and often challenges stereotypes, for example, those represented here by such figures as Aunt Jemima.
This is probably Duchamp's most controversial work, and perhaps one of the most controversial works of art in history. This is his Fountain from 1917. So that year, the American Society of Independent Artists hosted their annual exhibition, which was not juried. Anyone could enter for a small fee of $6. And so Duchamp anonymously submitted a porcelain urinal that he'd bought at a plumbing shop. He turned it on its side, therefore rendering it no longer functional, and signed it with a pseudonym, R. Mutt. This is a sort of play on the name of the manufacturer of the urinal, J.L. Mott Ironworks. The fountain was rejected from the show, as Duchamp sort of expected it to be. It's kind of absurd. This image, or rather this form, it incites laughter, anger, embarrassment, disgust. The urinal sort of references private bathroom activities and bodily functions that people don't really like to talk about. But most importantly, it calls into question what constitutes art. Can an artist use mass-produced products to create commentary on materialism and consumption? Or is that just laziness? Duchamp wrote an editorial and published with this photograph. He called it the Richard Mutt case. He wrote, "Whether Mr. Mutt made the fountain with his own hands or not has no importance. He chose it. He took an article of life, placed it so that its useful significance disappeared under the new title and point of view, created new thought for that object." So, what do you think? Does art have to be made by an artist? To what extent do materials have to pass through the hands or minds of the artist to be considered art? What makes this art and not just a regular object? Maybe the context? Duchamp returned to Paris in about 1919, where he began challenging the French art world. He was responding to current events. So in 1911, Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa had been stolen from the Louvre in Paris by an employee who believed it should be returned to Italy. This made the work even more famous than it already was, and it was being widely, although quite poorly, reproduced on postcards, posters, etc. So here we have Duchamp and a sort of modified ready-made. He has picked up a cheap postcard of Mona Lisa and drawn a mustache and a goatee on her face. The title, LHOOQ. These letters, when read aloud in French, sound a lot like a French slang phrase, which politely translates to "she's hot for it" or "she's got a hot ass." So sort of a crude sexual innuendo placed over the top of this very iconic image. Really kind of cheapens it in a way. Focuses the attention on the idea behind the work rather than the work itself, the final appearance or the process, really. So,
Duchamp pioneered the practice of appropriation, the deliberate incorporation in an artwork of material originally created by others. He appropriated objects like urinals and bicycle wheels and even other existing artworks, as with LHOOQ on the previous slide. Over time, other artists followed in his footsteps by continuing to incorporate found objects and images and by appropriating other artworks, including works by Duchamp himself. For example, the American artist Sherry Levine is known for her appropriation of famous paintings, sculptures, and photographs from the past. These works raise many questions. Who can be an artist? What role does the artist play? How has that role changed over time? What is originality and who can be original? The pieces Levine appropriates are generally by male artists who worked at a time when very few women artists were recognized in the art world, as has been the case throughout most of history. As feminist statements, Levine's work leads us to reconsider the structures of art institutions as they existed in the past and highlights the historic exclusion or absence of women. Her work, Fountain after Marcel Duchamp, recalls Duchamp's famous porcelain urinal from 1917. Unlike Duchamp, however, who took an existing urinal and declared it to be art, Levine had a urinal cast in bronze, which is a material traditionally used for fine art sculptures. Levine really encourages viewers not just to interact with her own work, but also to consider their attitudes towards Duchamp's urinal. So her quotation of a past artwork makes Levine's sculpture most meaningful for viewers who are familiar with Duchamp's work.
Duchamp was not the only Dada artist using found images. Here we have Hannah Hirsch. She was the only female member of the Berlin Dada group, and she contributed greatly to what's called photo montage. So it's sort of this innovation of collage using found photographs and mass media publications. Hirsch combines images and words from popular media. She worked at the time for the German publisher Ullstein Verlag, so she had access to many common mass media publications, magazines, advertisements, things like that. But she also used photographs and posters to sort of make a complex and kind of biting critique of Germany at this time. So this is probably her most well-known photo montage. It's titled Cut with the Kitchen Knife, Dada Through the Last Weimar Beer Belly Cultural Epoch in Germany. It's kind of a mouthful. But we have images of political figures, including Karl Marx in the lower right. There are Weimar government officials in the upper right. We also have images of machinery, architecture, dancers and athletes, letters, words, and phrases. And really this composition was sort of aimed at other members of the Dada group, kind of highlights their ideas about society and serves as a commentary on women's roles within society. Hirsch is kind of addressing how mass media portrays the women's figure, the women's identity rather poorly, kind of targeting them as both consumers but also commodities. The title here also implies the use of the domestic tool, a kitchen knife, which sort of conflates the traditional domestic role of women with the physical act of cutting out these collage images. Hirsch has incorporated famous and easily recognizable women into this montage to really reference modernity and female liberation. So in the center we have Nidhi Imgibbon, who was a dancer, a very famous dancer at the time, as well as the actress Asta Nielsen, the dancer Paula Negri, and then Hannah Hirsch herself is featured down in the sort of bottom right-hand corner here. She's included a little self-portrait. So nearby, she's pasted a map that shows the progression of women's rights in Europe. So she's really making commentary on this kind of growing modern society, the industrial machine age that was sort of the early 20th century, thinking about women's rights and female liberation in a still quite oppressive society. Hirsch was the only female member of the group, as I mentioned, and she did exhibit in the first International Dada Fair in about 1920. So here she is with her then boyfriend, who is another member of the group, Raoul Hausmann. And then here you can see on the wall behind them her cut with a kitchen knife collage. Barbara Kruger is an artist who appropriates advertising and marketing techniques. Since the 80s, she's been using found images and words in combination with her graphic design skills to challenge the expected meanings that we have based on our experiences with mass media or mass publications. So here we have a work untitled, Your Gaze Hits the Side of My Face. So this is sort of in an ad context, but there's definitely a feminist kind of overtone. We have a female mannequin, which is sort of the literal objectification of women. And that really, excuse me, the directness of the title and of the composition really forces the viewer to acknowledge the relationship with the viewed. It's not the gaze, it's your gaze hitting the side of my face. So the viewer has to acknowledge their sort of role and responsibility and the effect of the viewer and of the viewing. Really consider themselves as more of an active presence than a passive one. Here's another. This is Your Body as a Battleground from 1989. So the year 1989 was filled with protesting surrounding anti-abortion laws that were attacking the 1973 Roe versus Wade ruling. Barbara Kruger made this particular composition for the Women's March on Washington to support reproductive freedoms. So the woman's face here is sort of split, kind of disembodied and separated into positive and negative exposures, and then covered over with text, really marking the stark divide. So this is both art and protest, and even though it's tied to a specific moment in time, a moment in history, the power behind it is timeless. And as it turns out, apparently the issue that it addresses is rather timeless as well, because we're still dealing with these problems, right? Now, to switch directions ever so slightly, let's look at Jackson Pollock. He was one of the leading innovators of abstract expressionism in America, and he invented, I suppose we could say, action painting. Now, this is still painting, so it's not necessarily alternative media, but more of an alternative process. So this process brings the canvas off the easel and onto the floor and creates a surface for the artist to move around. So Jackson Pollock would place unstretched, unprimed canvases on the floor and then drip, fling, splash, and puddle paint onto them. So really the action is in the making of the work, but also in the seeing of the work. And so again, this isn't necessarily an alternative medium, still paint, but it is more of an alternative process. Pollock wasn't necessarily the first artist to pour or drip paint, but he's really the one who developed this action of moving around and within the canvas while making. In 1950, Time magazine named him Jack the Dripper. And so these may seem rather chaotic and unplanned, but Pollock claimed a lot of technical sophistication. As I mentioned, he was very aware of the quality of materials he was using, the viscosity of paint, and really he saw these as very intricate, kind of interlocking labyrinths or mazes to lose himself within. Robert Rauschenberg was an American artist. He was sort of inspired by abstract expressionism and action painting, but he takes that in slightly different directions. He said that his desire was to act in the gap between art and life. So he has a distinctive style of assemblage that he called combines, in which he would combine painting, collage, and sculpture using non-traditional materials. So a combine is not quite a sculpture, but not quite a painting. Sort of just mixed media, I suppose. But again, working in the space between the two, between sculpture and painting. So this is his bed from 1955. We have a pillow and quilt over which he has drawn and painted. So this is a real pillow, a real quilt and sheets. Sort of alludes to something outside of itself with this recognizable imagery. But then again, he's used pencil and paint to paint on top of it as if it were a canvas itself, and then hung the entire thing on the wall. So you can sort of see it here on the left from a bit of a side view and see how it protrudes into space there. It's kind of interesting, a strange in-between of the public and the private space. A bed is typically a very private, kind of intimate location for a person, not something you would necessarily have on display in a museum. Here's another. This is his Canyon of 1959. Here he's incorporated an assortment of old family photos, public imagery, including an image of the Statue of Liberty and fragments of political posters, as well as various other objects that he purchased or salvaged from the trash. There's a flattened steel drum, and then quite prominently we have this stuffed eagle, this taxidermied eagle that was donated to him by a friend. So it's sort of mounted on this box that is then mounted from the canvas, and it protrudes out into space. And then below it we have a dirty pillow tied with a cord, sort of suspended from the canvas itself. So again, this is one of his combines, which is a term that Rauschenberg sort of coined. Really not confined to the picture plane, or excuse me, the picture frame here, but extending beyond it, both sort of out forward into space and down below as well with that pillow. Rauschenberg grew up in Texas during the Depression and said, having grown up in a very plain environment, if I was going to survive, I had to appreciate the most common aspects of life. So he's exploring ideas of abstract expression, but using more representational subject matter. However, he's taking that subject out of context, giving it a new meaning in a new context. He incorporates trash and sort of discarded cardboard boxes, kind of just seemingly random things. And then he's also included that very loose application of paint, quite similar to the abstract expressionist. Really a sense of a lack of order, rather, but that's done so intentionally. We looked at this one a bit in week 1, but we'll talk about it again here, and perhaps it will mean a bit more to you now. This is his monogram of 1959. So he has the stuffed Angora goat encompassed in an automobile tire. and then installed sort of on this painted and collage covered base. Um, he made several attempts at this work. Initially, he tried to attach it vertically or set it up with some sort of vertical backing, but finally he decided to have it horizontal, which really even more so blurs that line between sculpture, collage, painting, kind of between 2D and 3D art. Um, your textbook talks about Rauschenberg creating this as a sort of outlandish symbol of himself as a rebel and outcast. So we already know he's challenging traditional conventions in the art world, ideas of what is art and what is not, and really trying to blur those boundaries between art and life. So the goat has for a long time been a symbol of male lust, but also it is a Christian symbol of wayward souls. So your book argues that this is then symbolizing Rauschenberg's own controversial behaviors, his own violation of artistic conventions. There's also sort of an erotic or sexual notion here, with the goat penetrating the tire. It stands on top of the painting, so it sort of dominates it, kind of the symbol of the established art world. And I think I mentioned when we discussed this last, it also defecates a dirty tennis ball on top of the canvas. So a pretty clear message there, I would say. But you can also see on the goat's face there, we have some sort of abstract expression-like paint application as well. So combining various media and really creating something totally new. So conceptual artists explore a variety of media, and really they use whatever they feel best represents their concept. Conceptual works often have some form of documentation of the concept or creation. These can be written text, photos, film, etc., because the art is the idea, which is sort of ephemeral in nature, right? However, because it's ephemeral, that also resists commodification. So it carries this implicit or explicit critique of those who place cultural and economic value on art. One of the most exemplary examples of conceptual art in the 60s is Joseph Kosuth's 1 and 3 chairs. So here you can potentially see the influence of Marcel Duchamp and the ready-made. Conceptual art really appeals to the mind rather than the senses. So Kosuth here has presented three things that a chair could be. So we have on the left a photographic representation of a chair. In the center we have an actual wooden chair. And on the right we have a dictionary definition of chair. So looking at these together sort of helps us realize how we learn about the world around us and explore both visual and linguistic symbols. So we have three distinct visual forms here that all represent a single abstract idea. So which of these is more real, or maybe which provides the most information? We could potentially read this as a single chair in three different formats. Or perhaps this is three different chairs. But again, is one of these more successful than the others? Difficult to say. Which of these is the most chair? I don't know. Artworks that are created through actions performed by the artist and other participants are considered performance art. These can be live or recorded, spontaneous or scripted. The term performance art really became widely used in the 1970s. And it really aligns with conceptual art because of its immateriality. Performance artists really like that liveness, that impermanence, as an alternative to the static permanence of things like painting and sculpture. Performance has really been a way of engaging directly with social reality and the specifics of the space, as well as the politics of identity. So one of the very influential individuals at the head of performance art is John Cage. And it may seem a little odd to include him in a discussion of visual art, considering he's primarily a musical composer, but his theories and ideas are, like I said, very influential to performance art. So Cage explored how chance could be used to eliminate intention or personal taste in art making. He created altered pianos, which he inserted objects between the strings of a piano to kind of alter the way they sounded when played. He also did things like play 12 radios at once or assign music notes to random markings on a piece of paper. So he's interested in sound and kind of chance. Um, his most well-known composition is titled 4:33, or 4 minutes and 33 seconds. Um, in this composition, the musician sat motionless for the full length of time, 4 minutes and 33 seconds, while the audience listened. He did this to call attention to the ambient noise that takes place even in what we consider silence. So there was no music being played, but if an audience member coughed or a car outside drove by and honked its horn, that becomes part of the composition. So it's really sort of a found soundscape. And he was really looking to potentially change the listener's relationship to the noises that they had heard after the performance. So again, blurring that line between art and life. Performance art really breaks all boundaries by actively invading the viewer's space and involving the audience, whether knowingly or not, within the work's production. So, in the late 1950s, the artist Alan Capro built on assemblage practices to extend the work of art into the space surrounding the viewer and create what's called environments. Capro said, "The artist must become preoccupied with and even dazzled by the space and objects of our everyday life." So we're looking at his yard of 1961. Here he has filled a courtyard of a gallery in Manhattan, New York, using old tires, tar paper, barrels, various things. And then he asked viewers to walk around and through it, therefore positioning them within and as part of the work. This really calls attention to the viewer's physical experience, how they see, move, touch, smell, hear, and all of the items in the room here are sort of related to the urban environment. So these would be elements that New Yorkers would engage with every day, but not really notice. So similarly to Cage, he's asking his viewers to become a little bit more aware, a little bit more cognizant of their daily experiences. So an environment invites viewers to interact with a static installation. A happening, on the other hand, is an immersive, chance-based performance that sort of overwhelms the audience with a barrage of unrelated activities that invoke a variety of sensual and emotional responses. So happenings involve elements of performance, dance, poetry, and visual art, really, again, blurring those boundaries between media as well as between art and life. And so happening, something spontaneous, something that just happens. These could be highly structured, kind of the artist could plan out the environment, the actions, the lighting, the sounds, all to be sort of integral within the work. Or it could be, again, spontaneous. It could just sort of unfold however it unfolds. You will become part of the happenings. You will simultaneously experience them as a viewer. So not only are you the viewer, you're also participating in the making of the work at the same time. So we're looking at a photo here of Carol Schneemann's Meat Joy happening from 1964. This was enacted first at the Festival de la Libre Expression in Paris, then again in New York, where it was filmed and photographed. So Schneemann had 8 men and women undress each other They danced and rolled around on the floor, kind of playing wildly and interacting with a mixture of raw fish, sausages, and partially plucked raw and bloody chickens, wet paint, scraps of paper, and other bits of materials. She wanted the performers and the audience to experience the smells, tastes, and feels of bodily fluids and materials. It's kind of off-putting, a little gross, right? And critics at the time called this an erotic rite or a visceral celebration of flesh and blood. But Schneemann here is really countering the idea of artwork and the art gallery as this sort of cool, detached space in which the passive viewer can come in and sort of just float through, and the artist remains invisible. Rather, she's forcing the viewer to become complicit in the making of the work, in the live event. Joseph Beuys was a German conceptual and performance artist. He often pulled from his own personal history and experiences for his subjects. He was a German fighter pilot, and he created sort of a personal mythology. So he claimed to have been shot down over Crimea during the war and saved by Tartar tribespeople who wrapped him in animal fat and felt in order to keep him warm. We do know that he was, in fact, in a plane crash, but the rest was not true. However, felt and fat became rather therapeutic symbols for him. They were tools that helped him heal, and he thought they would regenerate society's psychic wounds. He looked at his performances as social sculptures, actions intended to change society for the better. He believed everyone is an artist with the ability and agency to transform the world around them. So this photo is from his performance or his social sculpture, How to Explain Pictures to a Dead Hare from 1965. So within his works, he often took on a sort of shaman-like persona, and his actions had this sort of seriousness akin to sacred ritual with goals of spiritual renewal or transformation. This particular one he performed at an exhibition of his drawings. He sat in the window of the locked gallery. He covered his head with honey, which was representative of life, and a gold leaf mask representative of wealth. He cradled a dead hare in his arms and sort of muttered or whispered to it repeatedly. His left foot was attached to a piece of felt, which symbolized spiritual warmth, while his right foot is attached to a piece of steel, which symbolizes cold, hard reason. He carried the hare around the gallery for hours, sort of moving from artwork to artwork and holding the hare up, letting it look at the work, and then whispering in its ear, kind of quietly explaining the pictures. So what's all of this about? Maybe some sort of spiritual ritual, kind of brings about the idea of speaking to the dead or speaking to another realm. Maybe also a connection between humanity and nature, or perhaps commentary on the ecological impact that humans have on the environments, our need for animals and forests and trees, which Beuys sort of saw as an extension of ourselves. He saw them just as important as lungs and bones and organs to the human body. In 1974, he performed his I Like America and America Likes Me. He flew to America from Germany. He landed at JFK International Airport. When he deboarded the plane, he was wearing a fedora and a fishing vest, and he kept his hand over his eyes. Two men approached him and wrapped him in a large piece of felt, and then placed him on a stretcher and loaded him into an ambulance. With the lights and sirens going, they drove him to the René Block Gallery in Manhattan and then wheeled him inside, still on the stretcher. The gallery inside had been transformed into this sort of corral with a bale of straw, a felt blanket, a shepherd's crook, 50 copies of the Wall Street Journal, and a live coyote. So for the next 3 days, for 8 hours a day, Beuys stayed in this room with this coyote. He didn't speak or interact with any other humans. Instead, he attempted to make eye contact with the coyote, sort of performing symbolic gestures like tossing his gloves to it or dressing up as a shepherd and reaching out with the crook, although it did try to take the felt from him at one point. He did finally manage to get close to it, and it did finally allow him to touch it. So what's going on here? This is sort of an attempt to start a national dialogue. Remember, he believes that every artist is capable of social change. So the patriotic title, I Like America and America Likes Me, sort of recalls this idea of America as a melting pot where people of all backgrounds can coexist in harmony. But 1970s America was a very divided nation. There was lots of division over the involvement in the Vietnam War and over whose white population was oppressing indigenous, immigrant, and minority populations. The critic David Levi Strauss said Bowie's sought to confront the schism between native intelligence and European mechanistic, materialistic, and positivistic values. In some Native American beliefs, the coyote is portrayed as a trickster, but it's also representative of the possibility of transformation. European settlers viewed the coyotes as aggressive and intrusive predators and sought to eliminate them, but Bowie's made connections to the colonization of America and tried to activate a sense of spiritual healing by accepting the coyote. American society could only begin to cure its social ills through the direct communication with and understanding of its own varied populations. The coyote sort of serves as the spirit animal of Native America here. It's really adapted and it thrives in its new environment, and so it serves as a symbol of resilience. So again, Joseph Beuys saw art as a means of social redemption and healing, specifically from the horrors of World War II and the Holocaust, but from other social injustices as well. Now there are several more performance artists that we will talk about, but we're going to stop this conversation here for now, and then we'll pick those up again when we get to the themes and meaning section.
Last but not least, we need to address installations. Modern artists have explored many ways of expanding the range of sculpture as a medium, and installation sculpture involves the construction of a space or the assembly of objects to create an environment. The viewer is encouraged to experience the work physically using all of our senses, perhaps even entering the work itself. For example, Greek-born artist Athen Tacha's Star Fountain is a series of vertical glass columns organized into a spiraling shape with color changes over a 4-minute time span. Best viewed at night, the work is infused with constantly changing colored lights that imply the action of dance as the rhythms flow and repeat in graceful patterns. Another prominent installation artist is the Japanese artist Yayoi Kusama, who between about 1962 and 64 started sewing thousands of these stuffed fabric tubers and then began grafting them onto pieces of furniture and onto other found objects to create assemblage sculptures. She would then exhibit these sculptures together in an attempt to create a hallucinatory scene of phallic surfaces, but ultimately she found the repetitive labor involved both physically and mentally taxing. Soon she started to utilize mirrors to achieve a similar repetition. The reflective surfaces really allowed her vision to transcend the physical limitations of her own productivity and to create sort of this participatory experience by casting the viewer as the subject of the work, who is reflected almost infinitely within these mirrors. She refers to her later installations as infinity rooms. These works, such as Aftermath of Obliteration of Eternity from 2009, are mirrored chambers of golden, glowing lantern shapes, or sometimes she uses other colors. And these appear to float on their own, sort of like ceremonial luminaries. These installations typically have a low platform on which the viewer stands while alone in the room with the mirrored door shut so that they are sort of surrounded by infinity. Sometimes the floor is filled with a shallow pool of water that further reflects the lights and adds a natural element to the space, separating the viewer from the infinite walls and lights beyond. These infinity rooms are intended as introspective spaces for perceiving, listening, and feeling. Another sculptural art form is a tableau, or a stationary scene that has been arranged for artistic impact. The London-born Nigerian artist Yinka Shonibare creates disembodied and conceptual sculptural tableaus that explore issues of race and colonialism. He uses parody and masquerade to suggest things that are not always what they seem. Here, his mannequin figures are headless to reflect the violence of capitalism, and they wear Victorian-style garments made out of distinctive African-style textiles. These fabrics, which are sometimes called batik, are widely associated with Africa. In this context, they represent the multi-layered product of colonial exploitation. Wax-printed cotton fabrics like these were originally made in Indonesia and began to be industrially manufactured by a Dutch company at the end of the 19th century. When the material proved unpopular in Indonesia, these cheap fabrics were successfully marketed in West Africa. Shonibare inverts colonialist expectations by using cloth associated with poverty-stricken West Africans to outfit faceless and raceless aristocrats. In this installation view of the work Mobility, Shonibare created a family of 3 aristocrats riding unicycles with differing degrees of confidence and implied stability. The title of this piece brings in connotations of wealth and economic mobility, as well as travel or the ability to go places, often for pleasure, and bodily movement, or how able one is to get around. The playful and joyous mood of these artworks carries a serious message, though. In addition to commenting on economic disparities resulting from colonialism and capitalism, Shonibare is also referring to assumptions about physical ability. Having suffered complete paralysis after contracting a virus at the age of 19, Shonibare has been recovering ever since. A few years before he made this installation, Shonibare began using his art to confront his own mortality and the difficulty of living in his body. Like these unicyclists, for Shonibare, the very act of getting around presents quite distinct challenges. His works are intended to parallel his life and his worldviews. Just as he cannot be easily labeled as Nigerian or British, his figures and the textiles they wear cannot be easily categorized according to class, culture, or physical ability.